They said it was a joke. A publicity stunt. A ratings grab. When Italy's most cynical talk show host extended an invitation to the Vatican, the world laughed. Surely the Pope won't come. And if he does, surely he won't sing. But Pope Leo XIV did walk onto that stage. Not robed in gold. Not flanked by bishops. Just a man in white, carrying silence heavier than applause. And when he opened his mouth, not to speak, but to sing, laughter choked. Breaths halted. And every critic in the room forgot their next line. Because behind the curtain, a figure had entered unnoticed. Cardinal Tagle. Eyes locked on the stage. And what followed, changed the air in that studio forever. Asterisk, where are you watching from? Because this isn't just a story. It might be the moment you never expected, but always needed. If you're here to witness something divine in disguise, don't scroll past. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Still won't? Then tell us below. What stops you from believing that God might show up in the most unexpected place, even a talent show stage? Before he became Pope Leo XIV, he was just Father Mateo, the barefoot bishop of Manila. He walked alleyways that reeked of diesel and desperation, offering prayers in shanty homes, and baptizing babies beside rice sacks and rusted tin walls. He buried drug war victims with his own hands. He gave homilies to mothers whose sons disappeared. And when the conclave called his name, he wept. Not out of pride, but protest. Because the church had chosen a man who had never owned more than 3 pairs of shoes. They called him the reluctant lion. Soft-spoken. Stern-spined. Known more for silence than spectacle, and mercy over manipulation. But tonight, he wasn't in a basilica. He stood backstage in a dimly lit studio in Milan, waiting behind a curtain that once hosted burlesque magicians and novelty acts. The audience? Boisterous. The lights? Blinding. And the slot right before him? An opera-singing goat named Vivaldi, who had just bowed with more dignity than some ministers. And following him? A fire-juggling influencer with 2 million followers and no theology, but lots of skin. The absurdity was intentional. Because the host, Giulio Romano, was no fool. He was a calculated provocateur. A man who made his name ridiculing faith, dissecting religion like a relic, and inviting priests onto his show the way emperors once invited gladiators. And now? He had the Pope. A smirk curled across his face as he turned to the camera and announced with dripping irony, up next, a man of many talents. A bishop. A scholar. A shepherd of souls. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome His Holiness Pope Leo XIV. Ready to bless us, with song. The audience erupted. Some cheered. Some chuckled. The applause sounded more like applause for a circus act than a spiritual icon. But Leo didn't flinch. He walked in, not with grandeur, but gravity. Not to impress. But, perhaps, to interrupt. Asterisk, if the world's lost its reverence for mystery, maybe it's because too many chose mockery over meaning. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Still won't? Then right below, why do you think sacred moments only belong in churches, and never in places like this? The stage was too bright. The room too loud. But Pope Leo's presence was still. Giulio Romano leaned forward, posture theatrical, eyes gleaming with the kind of mischief that made his show infamous. So, Your Holiness, you sing too? He asked, grinning like a fox sizing up a dove. There was a pause. Intentional. Pope Leo smiled, not from amusement, but from memory. Only when my soul needs help remembering, he answered. Giulio chuckled, twisting the phrase into a punchline. And what will Your Holiness sing for us tonight? Gregorian chant? Perhaps something, auto-tuned? Leo's eyes didn't waver. An old Filipino lullaby, he replied. For those who never knew a mother's voice. The audience stirred. Some laughed politely. Some exchanged puzzled glances. But something in his tone didn't fit the room. It wasn't ironic. It wasn't entertainment. It was ache. Giulio tried again. His smile, now tighter. Do you expect to win, Your Holiness? Another pause. No, Leo said gently. But maybe someone watching will remember they're not forgotten. Studio silence began to thicken, not yet reverent, but uneasy. Because the crowd, conditioned to mock, was beginning to sense. This wasn't a showman. This was a shepherd, who had wandered into the wrong field. Giulio shifted in his seat. The usual rhythms weren't working. The jokes weren't landing. And the Pope, he wasn't playing along. He was standing, softly, in a storm Giulio didn't realize he'd started. If you've ever buried your tears under sarcasm, ask yourself, who are you trying to protect? Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Still won't? Then tell us below. What sacred part of yourself are you still too afraid to feel? Giulio's brow furrowed, subtly, but enough. His show thrived on control. On keeping the spotlight angled just right. But Pope Leo XIV had a strange way of bending light, without even moving. Giulio leaned in, his voice sharper now, lined with something he mistook for authority. Some say you're distracting the church, he said. That singing priests are for desperate headlines, not sacred duty. The room tensed. That word, desperate, hung like a hook. Pope Leo didn't flinch. He blinked slowly. Then breathed. Desperation is when a child cries in a war zone, and no one sings back. The air thinned. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. I've sung beside children whose lungs wheezed from tear gas, he said, voice steady. I've whispered hymns to mothers holding cooling bodies. I've hummed prayers over mud graves, because no priest was left to speak. I've sung, not to be heard, but to remind the broken that they are still seen. Giulio opened his mouth, but no sound came. Pope Leo's eyes didn't accuse. They mourned. If we can't sing where there's sorrow, he added, why sing at all? The audience, once casual, began to shift. Some leaned forward. Others looked down. One camera operator, normally robotic, let tears gather behind the lens. Because the room had changed. The curtain wasn't pulled yet. But something sacred had already stepped in. If this story is shaking something in you, that's not fiction. That's conscience. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Still won't? Then drop it in the comments, which part made you uncomfortable, and why. Be honest. Your silence is louder than you think. The moment Giulio lost the script, everyone felt it. His words came harder now, not playful but sharp, almost wounded. So is this just another performance for the cameras? He asked, his tone brittle with defensiveness. But the Pope did not match his pace. He looked down, briefly, almost prayerfully, then raised his eyes. Performance ends, he said softly, when the applause fades. But a hymn carries long after. There were no drum rolls. No dramatic lighting cues. Just the slow, deliberate movement of a man stepping forward, into silence. He wore no mitre. No embroidered robe. Only a plain white cassock, worn from washing, wrinkled at the shoulders, creased at the cuffs. No choir followed. No background track hummed. He placed one hand on the mic. Closed his eyes. And sang. It was not the kind of voice that wins competitions. It cracked. It trembled. It wasn't theatrical, it was torn. A lullaby in Tagalog. Ancient. Intimate. The kind whispered in slums at midnight, to children too hungry to sleep. The lyrics meant nothing to most in the room, but the ache translated perfectly. For 90 seconds, no one breathed deeply. Even the judges, scripted to smile, sat frozen. And then, as the final line hovered, barely audible, like incense dissolving into air, a door in the far left wing of the studio opened. And Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle stepped in. He said nothing. He walked slowly, reverently, like someone entering a funeral, or a birth. His hands were clasped, not in applause, but in intercession. His eyes glistened, not from lights, but from memory. And though he wore red, nothing about him felt powerful. He wasn't there to critique. He was there, to weep. This wasn't about talent. This was testimony. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Still won't? Then share your reason. Why does vulnerability on a stage threaten you more than pride behind a pulpit? The studio, once alive with chuckles and chatter, had turned graveyard still. The cameras kept rolling, but no one cared. The judges, masters of performance and pretense, sat without comment. One gripped her cue cards so tightly, they bent. Julio, usually quick with quips, swallowed. Then forced a laugh. Well, unexpected. The sound was thin. Hollow. It fell dead before reaching the floor. And then, Cardinal Tagle spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried like scripture read in a war zone. No, he said gently. Not unexpected. Just, necessary. He stepped forward, eyes not on the Pope, nor the audience, but on the very air that had changed. Some sing for fame, Tagle continued, for stages, for lights, for claps that vanish by morning. He turned, slowly, toward the camera. But others sing, because not singing would be betrayal. Because silence in the face of sorrow, is complicity. Julio shifted again, his face beginning to flush. But the Pope turned to him, calm, unwavering. You invited me to perform, he said. I brought a prayer instead. You asked for a show. I brought a wound. The lights above flickered, as if shamed. The world, Pope Leo said, doesn't need another act. He looked toward the crowd, many of whom had lowered their phones. Some wept quietly. It needs awakening. And with that, the performance, if you could still call it that, was over. But no one clapped. Because some moments don't demand noise. They demand repentance. If truth stripped of glamour makes you look away, maybe your faith was built on performance too. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Still won't? Then say it loud, what part of truth do you still demand should come with glitter? He did not bow. He did not wave. Pope Leo XIV stepped down from the stage the same way he had entered it, quietly, intentionally, without spectacle. Not as a star. But as a servant. Giulio Romano, still seated, looked up, his usual charisma collapsed into something more fragile. And then, something unexpected happened. The Pope extended his hand. Not in triumph. In gratitude. Thank you, Leo said softly. For making space, even by mockery. The words landed not as sarcasm, but absolution. Behind him, Cardinal Tagle joined, resting his hand gently on Leo's shoulder. Sometimes, Tagle said with the gravity of a man who had watched saints and traitors walk the same roads, the Lord enters through the back door, disguised as a joke. And then they left. No exit music. No slow-motion replay. No hashtag. Just the soft shuffle of shoes against studio tile, and a silence thick with something the cameras could not monetize. And yet, that silence did not stay in the studio. It spread. Across cities. Across screens. Across the thin spaces between cynicism and longing. That night, in homes across Italy, something strange happened. Not in parishes. Not in palaces. But in kitchens. In bedrooms. Young fathers who hadn't sung in years hummed to their sleeping children. Old women, once sharp-tongued about the church, sat still, hands over hearts. A lullaby echoed, not from speakers, but from memory. And in that memory, something sacred stirred. If this left you speechless, maybe that's the first time silence has felt sacred in a long time. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Still won't? Then tell us in the comments, why do you treat every act of grace like it must first entertain you? If you were in that studio, would you have laughed with the crowd? Or would something in you have gone still, before you even knew why? Would you have mocked the idea of a pope singing, or would you have heard a lullaby that somehow sounded like it was meant for you? Would you have dismissed the moment as strange, or joined the silence as if it were a hymn your soul had forgotten it knew? Ask yourself, when grace enters dressed in plainness, do you walk away bored? Or, do you listen harder? May we never miss God's voice, just because it's dressed in unexpected notes. May we not demand perfection before we allow ourselves to be moved. And may we remember, that sometimes, the holiest songs aren't sung in cathedrals, but on broken stages, under bright lights, when no one was expecting God to show up. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, not for spectacle, but for stories that still carry sacred whispers. Still won't? Then write your truth, which moment in this story stirred something in you, that you weren't ready to name?